Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming to this very special live stream on the Left Lens here. We are going to be doing a sort of 1-year anniversary panel of last year's Easter Sunday conversation, and it's on anti-Asian racism, the context of anti-Asian racism, the geopolitical context, the history. We're going to be getting into all of it. While you're here, though, before I bring on the esteemed panel, make sure that you're liking this stream as you're coming on. Just hit that like button. Make sure you're boosting the algorithm here on this Friday evening. Of course, subscribe to this channel as you're coming on here to watch this great panel. And of course, support my work at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong if you're able. Actually, where Carl Za is, one of our esteemed panelists, it's already my birthday. So consider giving a subscription if you are able. But nonetheless, I am going to just get to the panel here and I'm going to have them introduce themselves. So welcome, everyone. How are you doing this evening?
Hey, doing well, doing well.
Good. So yeah, how about you, Xiangyu? How about you start and just introduce yourself, just a few words about who you are, what you do.
Oh, hi everyone. Thank you, Danny, for having me on once again. And hello again, Carl and Amanda. I am Xiangyu, and I'm basically just some guy on the internet. Okay, in more seriousness, I guess I'm a communist rapper. I rap in Chinese. And through my music and also outside of my music, I like to do what I can do to educate people on the realities of imperialism and in particular U.S. imperialism, and which I guess is tied in with what we're talking about today. So yeah.
Great. All right. How about you, Carl?
Hi, I'm Carl Za. I'm a Twitter shit poster. I also run a podcast, Silk and Steel Podcast, focusing on China, surrounding regions, history, culture, and politics. And thank you for inviting me, Danny. It's great to see you all, Amanda and Xiangyu.
Yeah, great. And last but not least, Amanda.
Hey, I'm Amanda. I'm cat content only on Twitter. I also have a podcast, also called Radio Free Amanda, which is what I also go by online on Twitter. Offline, I'm an organizer. I do a lot of organizing against mass incarceration. And it's really great to thank you, Danny, for inviting me back onto this panel.
Of course. Well, thank you all for coming back because we have a lot to get to. I mean, last year was about Easter Sunday, so it's been actually a little bit over a year now since we last came together. And we spoke about anti-Asian racism, and we came together, I feel, because it's not talked about in the way that it should be talked about, right? There's a lot missing usually from the conversation. There was this huge upsurge of the Stop Asian Hate movement that occurred last year because there was more and more evidence of this violence, this wave of violence that came after the March 2021 murder of, I believe it was 6 Asian women at a spa in Georgia. And since then, and even before then, there were tens of thousands of attacks since the COVID-19 pandemic hit the United States and the Western world the hardest. But I wanted to come back together because I want to talk about what has changed. And I want to start with you, Amanda, because you actually tweeted about a recent case of this just horrific violence that Chinese workers and really workers of Asian descent broadly are experiencing. I mean, in the New York City, it's absolutely horrific. There almost seems to be a weekly case. But you spoke about a delivery worker who was recently killed just this month. Do you mind going into that and then maybe starting with this question of what has changed over the last year with Stop Asian Hate? Has anything really changed since then?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and answer that question first. Last year, during our Easter Sunday panel, that happened immediately after the aftermath of the shootings at the 3 Asian massage parlors. And in the year that's elapsed since, I don't really think much has changed. And if anything has changed, things have gotten a lot worse, right? We were subjected to another year of the COVID pandemic, which our government didn't really have any sort of response to, another year of escalating anti-China rhetoric, which also meant another year of like a huge explosion in anti-Asian hate crimes. I live in New York City right now, and I feel like New York City, along with a lot of other cities like San Francisco and Chicago, which have like large populations of working class Asian people, we are all experiencing an unspoken crisis of anti-Asian hate crimes. Just the top of my head, in New York City, you know, we had Michelle Go, who was pushed in front of a subway car a few months ago. We had Christina Yuna Lee, who was followed into her apartment, sexually assaulted, and then stabbed over 40 times. She was Korean American, 35 years old. And Danny, you mentioned Yan Ziwan, I believe his name was, and he was a Chinese delivery driver. He worked for a Chinese restaurant called Great Wall in Queens, and he works 7 days a week, and which is like pretty common for a lot of working class Chinese people. You know, they don't make a lot of money, so they work quite a lot. And a few days ago, while he was delivering Chinese food, someone just like came up to him and shot him in the chest and killed him. And so that is only the most recent incident of a long string of incidents that have been happening in New York City. So unfortunately, I feel like since our Easter Sunday panel last year, things have only escalated in terms of violent assaults against Asian people. Danny, I think you're on mute. Yeah.
Oh, sorry about that, everyone. I was just saying that, Amanda, I pulled up your tweet from earlier today because you pointed out something that I think is so important. We're going to talk about a lot, which is how the media is covering this, how the Western media, how the corporate media is covering these killings. And here you posted from what seems to be local, quote unquote local, corporate news.
New York Post.
Right. The New York Post, just corporate news then. And you highlighted, right, that the way that they were framing this was that he may have been killed in a simmering beef over duck sauce. So a joke, a racist joke in the media covering this murder. I mean, what more can we say? I don't know, man, if you want to react to that.
Yeah, I think this is, and maybe we can talk about this later, but this is like prime example of the way that, Asian lives tend to be regarded as cheap and disposable. And I feel like, that belief kind of undergirds our exploitation, right? U.S. militarism occupies and extracts cheap labor and resources from Asian countries. So, our labor is always considered cheap. Our food is always considered cheap. Our lives are always considered cheap. And this is what's reflected in a headline like this. His murder, which was like an awful thing. And, that he was a human being. And if you read any article about his murder, they interview a lot of people that he knew. And they always say that he always had a smile on his face, and he always, called everyone my friend. So he was a beloved member of the community, and he was a person. But in this story, his life and his murder is just reduced to a cheap racist joke, just like something that was lost over duck sauce. It's just so completely racist, and it's so offensive.
Yeah, yeah, and you mentioned too that this has gotten worse, and it has. There is a new study out, and I'll pull it up later, that came out from groups such as Leading Asian Americans United for Change and the Asian American Foundation that says that, the number of people who are blaming Asian Americans in the United States for COVID-19 has actually increased over the last year from 2021 to 2022. So when you're saying that it's gotten worse, I mean, that's just proven in the statistical data. It's right there in front of you. And these cases, these increased killings and violence against especially working people, which have also been proven to be the most targeted, right? Elderly, women, working people within this community. I mean, it's absolutely egregious. But I want to move on to our other panelists if they have any reactions, anything they'd like to say before we move on to anything else.
I just wanted to say, what Amanda said about the way Asian people are regarded. You see it unfortunately, you see it both from the left and the right. And the way that a lot of the left kind of justifies it, the way I see it, is they have this sort of stereotypical view of Asians where it's like, oh, we are white adjacent and we're all privileged. And this idea might come from the fact that the Asian Americans that are portrayed in the media tend to come from a certain class background, or the Asian people that they are in contact with have come from families that might be in STEM or whatever, and in their minds they don't the working class what really oh sorry I'm kind of bad at speaking. I'm not the best speaker, but what really needs to be highlighted is especially working class Asian people are very invisible in this society. Like for a lot of people, outside of ordering Chinese food over the phone or going to the restaurant to pick them up, they don't really I think most mainstream Americans or just non-Asian Americans, and even a lot of like second generation Asian Americans who are kind of estranged from the immigrant communities, they're just not really in contact with immigrant working class Asians, and there is this sort of divide, and because they're so invisible, there's this understanding, oh, we're like Asians are just a bunch of like rich people here to here who are white adjacent and exploiting everyone else along with the white people or whatever. It's a very reductive way of thinking about these issues, and it really does add to the anti-Asian racism that we see. And then to further compounding the issue is you have corporate media, the way that they present like Asian things. They'll have like a few. Let's be frank. They're diversity hires. I'm not going to name names because I'm trying to be civil, but I think we all know a few of them. They'll hire like a few of them who are like they're Asian in phenotype essentially. They're very removed from their own cultures, which it's no fault of their own in some cases. In other cases, it's an active choice, unfortunately, due to self-hate. And then they'll have them essentially parrot imperialist tropes about Asians, and then you end up with things like what is it, like a while back there was like this one white guy who went into this Brooklyn seafood buffet and killed a bunch of Asian uncles because he said he was there to save Asian women, because you have like unfortunately you have these diversity hires who like perpetuate certain stereotypes about about Asian cultures, and yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean those are those are really good points. I mean, this is a can of worms that I think we should open, because this is how even these mainstream studies are talking about it, that Asian Americans, quote unquote, just Asians in general living across the West, there is this kind of like just lumping all together, so you get rid of the class analysis, the class context, and also the geopolitical context. But I wanted to swing it over to Amanda. I know she wanted to say something. Then Carl, I want to get you in here as well.
Yeah. I wanted to speak to Xiangyu's point about East Asian privilege. Like just setting aside the fact that privilege is like a very limited analytical framework. What's really interesting that I find about a lot of these like East Asians who talk about this like East Asian privilege is that they will sort of reject the model minority myth because, you know, it is something to be rejected. But East Asian privilege is basically repackaged model minority myth, right? And this like idea of East Asian privilege or model minority myth, whatever you want to call it, it has done immense harm to the Asian American community because East Asian privilege or model minority myth, whatever, it sort of propagates this narrative that Asian Americans, all Asian Americans are upwardly mobile, successful, you know, at least middle class, make a lot of money, work white collar jobs. But a recent report done by a nonprofit called Robin Hood in collaboration with Columbia University, it was released recently, and it confirmed a lot of stuff that we've been saying like the past few years. In New York City, 1 in 4 Asian people, 1 in 4 Asian adults live in poverty. This was what the report said. And researchers of this report found that 23% of Asian New Yorkers lived in poverty in 2020, which is comparable to the rate of poverty experienced by Black and Latino New Yorkers and higher than the citywide average of 16% of all New Yorkers. And it goes on to say that the poverty rate of Asian New Yorkers who are 65 or older in 2020 was 28% compared to 23% for seniors citywide. Researchers also found that the poverty rate among Asian New Yorkers with a high school degree or less in 2020 was 33% compared to 27% of all New Yorkers. So there have been reports published previously that, said that Asian Americans experience the highest poverty rate in this city. If you go to Chinatown, you don't see East Asian privilege there. Chinatown in New York City is one of the poorest areas in the city, but Asian American poverty isn't really a problem that a lot of people recognize because of this so-called model minority myth or East Asian privilege. And communities like New York City, Chinatown struggle to get the resources it needs because people don't recognize poverty as a problem that Asian Americans suffer.
Yeah, and Chinatown, I mean, the way that it was hit during COVID-19, even before COVID-19 supposedly, quote unquote, came, who knows how long the virus was spreading in the United States, but even prior to March 2020, because of all of the media hysteria about China and the virus and lockdowns and all of that, a lot of people were already shutting out Chinatown as a destination, and it really hurt a lot of people. And you see in the food lines all across Manhattan, there's a lot of especially older Chinese women just lining up because of how devastating this pandemic has been. But Carl, haven't heard from you yet. We got to hear from you. What's going on? Do you have any reactions?
Well, I have been living in Bali for almost 3 years now, so I'm kind of experiencing America vicariously through you guys, from your tweets and from the news item that pop up on my Twitter feed. And I have to say, leaving US and view it from a distance really makes me realize how crazy US is as a place. When I still live in it, sometimes you just kind of accept it the way it is. But when you remove yourself from it and view it from distance, it's all these excuses, all these talk about East Asian privilege in the aftermath of anti-Asian violence and crimes. This is just an excuse, right? Like, why are we doing victim blames here? I mean, this reminds me of I'm in Indonesia. This reminds me of the anti-Chinese pogrom here in Jakarta back in 1998. During the during the 1998 after the aftermath of 1998 Asian financial crisis. At the time, the common reframe is, oh, because Chinese people control large share of the Indonesian economy, people are just venting anger. But what really happening is the tycoons, of the few rich tycoons who actually do control large swaths of Indonesian economy, they're on the private chartered flight out to Singapore, to Australia. Well, before the violence broke out, the people who bear the brunt of the violence are the vast majority of the Chinese Indonesians on the streets. These are like the little street vendors, right? Just the same working class people that's being attacked in New York, Chinatown right now. And so like at this juncture, to bring up the East Asian privilege, to me that sounds like an excuse. I mean, the underlying all that, all this rhetoric is that the Asian don't really matter. The Asians deserve what they get because they're less than human beings. I mean has been conditioned in U.S. for God knows how many years now. I mean, it really starts way back from the yellow peril rhetoric back in 1900s. No, even going back before 1900, going back around the gold rush time, right? In the late 1800s, it's always the idea that somehow the Asians are somehow less than human. They are always presented. We are always presented as a disease vector, or we're working too hard to take away other people's jobs. In any case, we somehow do not deserve a good life in the United States. That's all the underlying premises of all these excuses I see for the kind of any kind of anti-Asian crime and violence. I mean, it's really upsetting for me. But I'll get off my rant and then let the other panelists chip in.
Well, I think that's a really good point, because we do have to talk about this history, and we do have to talk about the geopolitics, or for lack of a better term for it, right? Because one thing I've really noticed, I mean, first of all, this East Asian privilege, all of that, it sounds like it comes from the same academic institutions that have given us all of these China watchers and all of these kind of pseudo-academic journos, across the board, that I know, Carl, you have sparred with on more than one occasion. But it really is this, for me, what I've noticed across the political spectrum in the United States, that there is this understanding of China, especially as like controlling the United States government, as being this kind of all-powerful entity that is somehow pulling the strings, right? This yellow peril that is a quote unquote threat to the existence of the Western way of life, the US way of life. And there's no reflection or understanding of how that impacts the situation domestically, right? Because we can talk about the whole geopolitical situation, and I'm sure we will, but even just the impact of framing the situation between the US and China in that way reinforces this myth that China is a quote unquote threat, and therefore people who are Chinese or associated with China, because we know how imprecise racism is, they are also representatives of this threat and therefore targets, right? And so there's a whole lot we can get into, but let's Xiangyu, do you have anything you want to add or react to, or even just put into this conversation?
I think what Carl said about Asian lives just not being seen as valuable. It's when I was younger and I would go back to Taiwan in the summer, sometimes people there would ask, so do you experience racism abroad? And that was always a very confusing question, because I mean, what did they mean by it? I mean, nowadays most people know it's improper to go around calling people chinks. I mean, it does happen, but it's very possible that you can grow up and not get called that directly to your face. But then it's more it's more of the way that your culture is framed by a lot of people in the mainstream culture. Like I remember in 7th grade, social studies teacher, we were learning about the Cold War, like rudimentary bits and pieces of it. and we got to the Korean War, and we learned how the war ended in a stalemate, and how that was only a possibility because Mao was this like maniacal Chinese dictator, and how he had to him he had so many he had like an unlimited army of people that he could just throw into Korea to their deaths, as if these people are just mindless drones and that their lives didn't matter, and it's not because they decided to go resist U.S. imperialism and aid Korea because their revolution was on the line. Like, imagine if MacArthur had crossed into the Yalu River. I mean, China was the target during that time, but that's besides the point. It's just this sort of framing, and it's just so casually taught as if it's fact, and people don't really question it, especially if they don't have cultural connections, and or like they might just listen to some Asian Americans who also are a little bit estranged or don't really understand these things, which is pretty common. And then they think, oh well, I have an Asian friend who confirms my biases, so yeah, this is fact, and everything else is just a conspiracy theory or Russian propaganda or Chinese propaganda or whatever. Because that's what a lot of people are saying now. If you challenge the liberal imperialist narrative, before they even question things, they'll just be like, oh, that's a conspiracy theory, or oh, you're just a Russian bot, you're just a Wu Mao, like that's the way things are nowadays.
I also want to just add in I guess a shots fired moment. I feel like Promise Lee is just like like the media's kind of version of that. Like the person who just like comforts on the left, especially just comforting all of the anti-China hawks. But anyway, I
Literally
digress.
every article that's come out that's about tankies that's come out in the past 3 months, he's interviewed in that article. It's like someone should create a bingo card of all of these different tropes of or like these cliches of all of these anti-tanky articles coming out, and he would be one of the squares.
Lausan is the tanky watcher. Anyway, anyone want to jump in? Amanda, Carl? Yeah, so I mean, that's a really good point that Xiangyu made though about the way that this history is taught, how Chinese people are framed, and just how people in resistance in that region are framed. And I know Xiangyu, I definitely want you to talk about the TPRK a bit before we end this stream. But I also want to recommend that people watch the Battle of Lake Changjin. That's like an amazing film. I think you can still watch it on YouTube. I watched it on YouTube. It's an incredible film about.
They took it off YouTube, but you can find it on Vimeo. I found a link on Vimeo. So just Google search it. Just Google search
Yes.
it. Do like a video search on the name, the Battle of Lake Changjin. So I found it on Vimeo. You can find it. It's all subtitled in English. It's 3 hours though. 3 hours.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm worried about part 2. I hope part 2 is as good, but I'm skeptical. But yeah, let's get into China because in the geopolitical context, because I feel like this is the missing piece, because across the political spectrum, you have most people ignoring this relationship between U.S. policy toward China and the rise in anti-Asian racism. It's almost entirely framed, and it's not 100% incorrect, but I think it's simplistic to say that only the spread of COVID-19, this pandemic, has led to this rise in anti-Asian racism. And I think it's very simplistic because it ignores, first of all, the history that you talked a bit about, Carl, that led up to this moment, and also the fact that when COVID-19 was discovered for the first time in Wuhan, already at that point, the U.S. was engaged in a multifaceted, comprehensive new Cold War against China that includes all fronts: economic, military, political, diplomatic, and propaganda. So what do you all have to say about this relationship, and is there anything you want to particularly focus on? I know all of you have done a lot of work on the propaganda side of this, so maybe we can start there.
I think the anti-China propaganda and the anti-Asian hate in U.S. They mutually reinforce each other, right? I mean, that there's not like sometimes it's hard to see which one is a chicken, which one is an egg, because they all it constantly feeds upon each other. And to talk about anti-China propaganda, so one of the favorite terms people throw around, I see people throwing around in the Anglosphere, is they call it the Chinese people brainwashed robots. And that term, brainwash, inter-English language lexicon during the Korean War. And that's because, there were some American POWs who chose to go to China instead of returning to the United States. At that time, the U.S. could not explain it. So they come up with this idea that the Chinese literally not literally, but brainwash them into thinking that socialism is better than capitalism, and let these innocent poor American POWs be indoctrinated and chosen China instead. So that's the time when the term brainwash originated, started to enter into the English language usage. I mean, this is like there's a whole history of how these kind of the anti-Chinese racism is permeated in our society from something as simple as a linguistic term.
Yeah. I mean, you see it everywhere. Whenever you point out, right, that people in China, when they're polled by like the Harvard Ash Center, for example, what do you think about your government? And 90+% say they approve. You bring that point up, and what are you immediately responded with? It's, oh, they are brainwashed. They can't speak out. They're so scared. They're so scared of answering honestly because of the consequences. I mean, it's again this whole notion that China is so big and so bad that it can dictate and control in people's minds in a way that not even the United States can, because the United States has all of these problems, all these crises, economic, right, approval rating for, but yet the approval rating for Joe Biden is so low, and the trust in Congress is so low, right, way below 50%. We're talking about single digits at times with U.S. Congress, media, all of it. There's a deep lack of distrust and such an immense amount of propaganda. Yeah, China somehow does it better. I don't know how they do it. They're but anyway, I don't know. Amanda, do you have any? Carl, you can go.
Sorry, I remember just to piggyback. I remember there was a U.S. China Watcher panel talking. One of the main topic is the Chinese government legitimate? I'm like, how come none of these experts pose that question about United States? Like you said, right now, currently at this time of Biden presidency, he has lower approval rating than Trump during the exact same time period. I mean, nobody is questioning is U.S. government legitimate, right? But they feel free to project whatever fears onto China, because China is this great unknown, and a lot of time China serves not as serve as a foil, this kind of imaginary land that we project all our fears onto, and this is great boogeyman. And if you challenge their narrative, you get called brainwashed bots, of course.
Yeah, I want to return to the point of imperialism a bit later, but I wanted to add to Carl's point about Chinese people being brainwashed and this like popular image of Chinese people as robots. And I think that is part of this overall narrative of China being, too advanced, too technologically superior, in that, they have created all of this technology which, supposedly they use in the service of like a surveillance state. But, this narrative that they have sort of passed the West in terms of technological superiority. And, a lot of people will say that media representations of China are Orientalist, meaning that they see the East as backward, primitive, fixed, and unchanging. But I think what we're seeing now more of is a kind of techno-Orientalism, which is kind of the opposite. That, China is too technologically advanced, too robotic, but culturally inferior. So they have all of this advanced technology, but they are culturally inferior and they don't know how to use it for humanity and for the common good. And I think you really saw this a few months ago with the Olympics, right? In every video or article that was written about the Olympics, one common image that you saw was the Chinese worker in the hazmat suit. Like, this was constantly invoked, the specter of the Chinese worker in the hazmat suit. And so in those suits, people become unrecognizable and they look like robots. And so for a lot of Westerners, it stokes a particular fear about how, the communal is prioritized to this extreme in China, that all individuality is lost and like they're no longer humans. And you would see like pictures of like people in hazmat suits. You would see videos of robots disinfecting stuff. And this was, people actually saw this as weird, but it's not weird. Like they're trying to, you're trying to like manage a global pandemic. So it seems like perfectly normal to have, robots serving you food, or robots doing cleaning, robots doing disinfecting. So it's a kind of a way that China is exceptionalized. And like another example of this like kind of techno-Orientalism was all of these stories about fake snow. And, I guess like the Beijing Olympics, they relied mostly on fake snow for a lot of the like winter sports. And so there was a lot of like scaremongering over, like how this fake snow was framed as a triumph of man over nature, and how many gallons of water were used to create it, how much energy snow machines consumed. And it was just like basically a way for them to talk about China in the context of climate change, and how, China is now like the leading producer of CO2 emission. And it's just like a very, it's like kind of a dog whistle in that, it's like a Malthusian dog whistle about how China has an overpopulation problem, and they have to be stopped at all costs. Otherwise, they're just going to consume the Earth's resources.
Oh yeah, this is total projection. Like the kind of the fear of technology. The Chinese people actually have a very different attitude toward technology than the Western public. I mean, in a way, it's understandable. A lot of the people in the West have a fear of technology because their government do use technology to survey them, to invade their privacy, to control them. This is go read the history of the secret military history of the internet, the Surveillance Valley. It's a book by independent journalist Yasha Levine, which actually talk about this. He talk about how internet was originally designed as a network to keep tabs on people, to monitor and to squash any potential insurgency inside United States. But when people, instead of focusing on what's actually happening in US, people like to project it onto this China, which is a blank canvas, because nobody knows anything about China. And if you look at what they actually call dystopian about technology use in China, you have the robotic dogs walking along streets in Shanghai, broadcasting messages, doing a public announcement, informing people to come out to do COVID tests. Now, the same robotic dogs is used in United States for military and police use. And those robotic dogs, there's a, I don't know if they have already put it in plans, or somebody suggested to use a robotic dog to patrol the U.S. borders, to search for, to hunt for the refugees who are streaming from into U.S. from Mexico. And Boston Dynamic designed these giant robotic dogs specifically for the U.S. military, and yet we see this robotic dog in China broadcasting COVID public announcement to ask people to come out to do COVID tests. That is dystopian, right? And so again, it's people taking their understanding of their own society, U.S., and projecting that into China. You don't find when I traveled to China in 2019, I do not find the people in China have that kind of the same alarmist attitude to our technology. Well, I mean, yeah, because unlike US, because in US other technology is used to control people, right? And but in China, people see technology improves their lives, so that's a big difference.
Yes, yeah, you jump in. I know you've been waiting.
Okay, so a lot of great points that were made. I just want to go back and talk about I think it was Amanda who made the initial point. Oh, now it's all just me, so I feel anxious because I don't see other faces. It's okay.
All right,
how
no, it's cool. It's cool.
no,
It's
I was
cool.
just playing. But how there's when the approval rating is like a certain number, there's like, oh, the Chinese people are afraid to speak out because they're afraid of because everything is so authoritarian. But I want to pose this question. Let's look at any major U.S. celebrity. Who's like, who are some of the biggest celebrities right now? Can you guys help me out and just drop names?
What, like Beyonce?
Okay, yeah. If Beyonce comes out and talks about the conflict in Ukraine that's going on, and talks about it in a way that challenges both the U.S. and NATO's narrative, you don't think she's gonna get canceled and basically get blacklisted and lose a lot of sponsorships and lose a lot of airtime? Probably, right? And this applies even more so to celebrities that are not as big as Beyonce. And the second point is anti-China sentiments, as you guys pointed out, certainly do rise when the U.S. ruling class does feel threatened that it is going to be surpassed in some way, whether it be in international politics, like its influence, and or economically. I mean, you look at Japan in the 1990s. The U.S. was kind of anti-Japanese sentiments were on the rise because there was this fear that Japan was going to surpass the U.S. So, I mean, when you look at China right now, like economically, the way it's handling COVID, the way it's running a society, it's objectively observable that it's surpassing the U.S. Now, the only way that the U.S. can say, okay, well, we're still better in one way is because this gets subjective. It's the cultural superiority or inferiority, and when this is when this is the only talking point that's left, you have to play up the whole, oh well, we're culturally superior because we have this sort of liberalism and we have these this idea of universal values and human rights, this and that, and China doesn't, so they're inferior. All the while, just not really introducing people to the way Chinese people think and Chinese philosophy, and also, I don't know, just the fact that the two countries are in different developmental stages, so you're going to have different levels of the conceptions of, what are universal rights, this and that. I got into it in a previous panel about why North Korea is in many ways more authoritarian than the U.S., but also the context and why the people do accept it and why it's unfortunately necessary. And a lot of this is kind of pushed to prevent the people in the U.S. from questioning the current system. Because if people are made to believe, okay, well, things over here are failing, our infrastructure is falling apart, there's a rise in drug addiction and mental illness and homelessness and, things like that, then and people are questioning these things, then they might start looking at alternatives. But if you let them feel, okay, well, of all of the options out there, ours is the least worst. It's to prevent people from questioning the system and looking at, because I mean, China is an example. I mean, I'm not saying, oh, we look at China if you're an American and you just copy everything China does, because every country has its own history, has its own culture, has its own historical geopolitical context. If you're going to recreate your society or improve your society, you're not going to just copy everything blindly, but there's definitely things that can be learned. And yeah, that poses a challenge to the ruling class. And yeah, and also the alarmist attitude that people have in the US is certainly a form of projection, because you look at the dictatorship of what's essentially, you were entering a stage of high tech, low wages. And look at the past elections. I mean, are we, you got to be kidding yourself if you're not thinking, oh, big tech didn't have some sway in the election, right? They're talking about, oh, Russian memes and bots securing Trump's victory. But even if that were true, isn't the fact, don't algorithms, don't big tech on its in and of themselves influence the outcomes of elections far more than any individual actor or state actor from like Russia can? That's a question that we should be asking ourselves, right? And it's this sort of projection, you can't imagine tech in any other way, because big tech in the U.S. serves the biggest of the big capitalists, whereas in China, it's everything's kind of, things are run differently there. You have the Communist Party of China that puts, I mean, it doesn't matter how you look at it, but profits don't always come before the party. The party the party comes before profits. And what the party represents, well, it's up to your interpretation, but many people feel that the party is there to for the most part maximize the gains for the people.
Yeah, Jack Ma has nowhere near the power in China that Jeff Bezos does, or Elon Musk for that matter. And like you said, a lot of things projection and copium. I mean, remember a few years ago, the people are still talking about how Chinese cannot innovate, right? This is kind of this, somehow China suffers this inferiority. I mean, like the cultural inferiority that you guys talk about, because somehow the Chinese culture is so rigid and authoritarian that people cannot innovate, right? I mean, that's, if you still think that's the case, you haven't been paying attention. You just go. I mean, that one thing I realized when I visited China in 2019 is that in many ways, China is far far ahead. Just in terms of just simple thing as mobile payment, right? I traveled through China, through much of South China. All I have to do is pay with my phone, with my. I didn't have to carry cash around. I pay my with my WeChat, or Alipay. But that as soon as I cross the border into Hong Kong, and suddenly I have to find coins, physical coins, to feed into the, to take a metro, to take a train. I was like, oh my god, it's like feeling like going back a century. But yeah, people just don't. A lot of the problem is people in US just don't know. So China is whatever they want to be, and most of the time they just want China to be this backward place so they can still feel better about themselves.
Yeah, and before I want to kick it back to Xiangyu, but what you were saying, Carl, and you too, Xiangyu, is just that, I mean, there's this huge divide that, especially among, let's call it the American working class, whatever that is, because we know that it's multiracial. We know that there's a lot of complexity in the working class in the United States, politically, economically. But there is this use of China, this exploiting of this anti-China propaganda as a means to divide working people across the board. And it places blame onto China, right, as this communist boogie, this new, like, quote unquote authoritarian dictatorship that, I mean, has been around for a while and was a target of the United States ever since the Chinese Revolution. But now, right, now that China is in this very interesting position that I don't think the United States is really prepared for, in this technological kind of advanced stage. I mean, when you were talking, Carl, about paying with WeChat and Alipay, I had cab drivers looking at me. I was there at the end of 2019, early 2020, cab drivers were like looking at me weird. Like they're just like, why are you trying to give me this RMB in paper form? Like they kept on being like, oh, you don't speak Chinese, so I'm just gonna point to my phone until you get it that you're supposed to pay this way, you know. But that's how I felt too. It's just like, wow, this is not even what I expected. I thought I was going to see a lot more of the underdevelopment, a lot more of the quote unquote contradictions that especially even the left likes to talk about, right? Like China is, even if it's advancing at the expense of people. But I just saw a lot of just overall benefit for people in terms of transit, high-speed rail, in terms of how people were able to, for example, get very heavy subsidies on things like electric cars and renewable energy. I mean, it was really interesting, and people were very confident too. And they would ask me, "Hey, are you scared about being in the United States right now? Because people are just getting shot up there." And I'm just like, yeah. It's like, it's a thing. It's definitely a thing. But Xiangyu, I know you wanted to jump in here.
So Carl talked about how there is this sort of perception that Asian people or Chinese people in general, or Chinese people or Asian people in general, are not creative and cannot innovate. And part of that kind of misconception comes from the fact that for the longest time, economically, China was kind of was a factory for the world, because when it was still building up its economy. So of course, education wise and stuff, people were more focused on the skills that were required to get that stuff done, to get like manufacturing and that sort of stuff done for foreign companies. But then after it reached a certain economic point, to the point where it can actually start innovating, that's when there was this sort of cognitive dissonance when they realized, oh, Chinese people are not just innately robots or not innovative. It's because there were different priorities in the economy at different points in time. And now that it's at the stage where innovation is a priority and they're doing a pretty good job at it, that's when people are starting to feel threatened.
Yeah, Amanda, do you want to jump in?
Maybe I'll jump in and sort of like talk a little bit more about the geopolitical context and
Please.
the link to this rise of anti-Asian assaults. Danny, you mentioned a little bit earlier in the show about this new study that came out talking about the rise in anti-Asian violence and how it's really escalated. So I've read a couple of articles about that study, and I think what's really remarkable about that study is that the CEO of the nonprofit that published this study, the Leading Asian Americans United for Change, he actually said that he actually implicated media representations of China and anti-China news stories as largely a reason for this spike in anti-Asian violence that we're seeing. And he said, politicians need to be very careful with all this bashing of China because it directly influences how people view and treat Asian Americans in the US. And I think I think it's really remarkable because this is really the first time in like something mainstream that we have seen someone say that this China bashing directly is a reason for the rise in these anti-Asian hate crimes that we're seeing. And, I think that's, good news that someone in the mainstream is finally admitting it, right? Because for the past 2 years, what I've seen for the most part is a lot of people arguing that there's no evidence that this anti-China media coverage is what's causing all of these hate crimes. And a lot of people were seemingly wanting to like see a direct link that, like a Washington Post article bashing China was the reason for Christina Unalee's death. Her murderer read a Washington Post article that was anti-China, and that's what led him to sexually assault her and kill her. And as we know, the link is not that direct. What this kind of anti-China new Cold War coverage does is it contributes to an existing atmosphere where Chinese and Asian people have historically been dehumanized, and that's what makes them more vulnerable to attacks. So I just wanted to point that out because, insofar as like people were, bringing up China, they were just saying that this spike in anti-Asian violence was due to Trump referring to COVID as the China virus. But as we all know, that's a really ahistorical view of anti-Asian racism, because, Chinese people have been vilified in the like Western imagination, since Chinese people have immigrated here to like pan for gold, like back in the 19th century, right? Yeah, and I'll leave it at that. So,
Yeah, I mean, Donald Trump didn't make that up out of his head. I mean, that's just, I mean, all the liberals would say, "Oh, Trump is so stupid," but yet the whole framing of like Trump being this individual that created, that kind of like sparked this wave of anti-Asian racism gives him not just a whole lot of power, but also I feel like a whole lot of credit for something that has such a long history and really does, as you said, Amanda, it does connect to this new Cold War propaganda, which has policy to it, right? It's not just ideas, right? It's
I
an old Marxist dictum that it's not just ideas just don't come out of nowhere. But Carl, yeah, I'll let you jump in.
I think Trump is popular in some circles because he says the quiet things loud, right? I mean, like it's not like what he says are just Trump takes credit for making up of all the things he said. These kind of memes have always existed, but for a long time they're being suppressed. People understood it's not something to talk about in polite conversation. But racism has always existed in US, and what Trump is doing is just amplifying the existing racism that's already there. And what Amanda said earlier about mainstream media finally admitting to the link between the xenophobia they whip up in mainstream media versus the anti-Asian crime on the street is that it's hard to cover up anymore. It's so in your face, right? I mean, like anytime they report a COVID outbreak in Chicago or New York, they put a picture of a street view of Tokyo, of Hong Kong, of all these East Asian people wearing masks. It has nothing to do with the article itself, but visually it links again, Asian people to COVID. They've done it again and again and again. I mean, this is not a coincidence anymore. So I think I'm glad that's been called out, but it's really hard to deny that anymore. I mean, this is what what Trump created is an atmosphere where all these people felt it's safe to do so. It's safe to come out and say all the racist things and to do this right in the open.
Right, kind of making it used to be privately, right? It just happened in a day to day. People wouldn't talk about it, but then Donald Trump used his very public forum to give expression to something that has been just running rampant. And I want to get into why. I think one thing that is, I think a big thing that is ignored. It's like the why. Like, why is this actually happening? I mean, COVID-19 is used as this it's very convenient. It's a huge crisis. It just so happens that a lot of the framings around COVID-19, given the long history of linking disease to Asians, to especially Chinese, right? This real racist Orientalist trope. But then there's like the why, the context of it, and no one's really talking about this. The policy, right? What is the U.S. policy? What is the policy that is being engaged in by the West toward China and just in the region? Because Xiangyu, I want you to jump in here at some point. So I want you to also talk about the DPRK, because this is a real imperialistic, I feel like, propaganda war that targets China for very specific reasons. And let's get into that, because I know we got like half hour. I can go a little bit over that, but let's get into this because I feel like this is part of the meat of this conversation. Whoever wants to start.
Well,
Maybe
before
it's
we
Xiangyu.
get to the next topic, can I just add my final thoughts to what Carl was saying?
Go ahead.
I think what Carl said about Trump is if you think about it, everything that Trump said was extremely tame in comparison to what was said on Comedy Central in the 2000s. Wouldn't you guys agree? Oh, you guys are. Anyways, you're on mute.
We're all muted.
Yeah, and I think Carl saying that what he did was appeal to the masses. There is some truth to that because I think people really embraced Trump's kind of open bigotry because as a knee-jerk reaction to the sort of PC culture that really flourished during the Obama era, that was very performative. It really did not seek to solve problems at their root. It was filled with virtue signaling, and it was really promoted in academia and like college campus circles. And the way that people would go about it was they would learn a few things about privilege and then talk down on average, working people, saying, "Oh, you're problematic, you're this, that," but then not really engage in good faith and try to address these issues and help them, grow as people, but to just absolve their own white guilt on an individual level in the most performative manner possible. And that stuff turns people off. And then unfortunately, although their intentions might be good, the result is you have this sort of knee-jerk reaction that, gives rise to what we saw during what basically got Trump elected. Yeah. And now I'm done with my thoughts on this topic. Sorry. And we can move on to the imperialist thing.
No, I think that it's important, right? It's true that the kind of this liberal framework, this neoliberal quote unquote identity politics, whatever we want to call it, does just so happen to fuel it by decontextualizing, ignoring class, ignoring imperialism, just ignoring the realities, and not offering really anything except perhaps some select careers for people in think tanks in DC and whatnot. That does, I think, only strengthen and make imperialism, make this aggression toward China more effective. But let's talk about what is this? What is happening with the U.S. and China right now? What is the United States doing that really requires this rise in anti-Asian racism? Because I don't think it's a coincidence that the U.S. just so happens to call, I think the CIA director William Burns has called on numerous occasions China the greatest threat to the United States' national security and future. So I don't know who wants to start, either Amanda or Carl.
Well, I just want to say, then you have to define what is U.S. national interest, right? People use that term a lot. What China's rise does not threaten is the average life of average Americans, right? They always present China's rise as some kind of existential threat, but existential threat to whom? China's rise is a threat to to all the people who climb onto the U.S. hegemony. In a way, I don't even think China's rise is a threat to the people who profit from the military-industrial complex, because China's rise for them, it just means more fodder for amping up the China threat to justify more defense spendings. To keep piling on the $1 trillion defense budget that we already have. So it's pretty ludicrous statement, but you have to keep in mind right now the China threat is a large grift. It's literally $1 trillion grift for people to hype up so they can keep on milking keep on milking all these $1 trillion we spend on defenses rather than improving infrastructures and healthcare inside United States.
Yeah, man, jump right in.
Yeah. I'm really glad that you brought up imperialism, because in order to address this crisis of anti-Asian hate crimes that we've been seeing, we really have to, go and address the root of the problem. And what I've been seeing in a lot of the media response is that there's been a fixation on apportioning individual blame onto like individuals. And they often sort of fixate on the motivations or criminal histories of the killers. And by kind of placing blame on individuals rather than the root cause of the problem, which is imperialism, it leads people to these really reactionary places and these really reactionary conclusions. And so in New York City, this plays into this pro-cop agenda of Eric Adams. And it creates a situation where we have to be really careful in the way that we talk about this, because Eric Adams has been ordering he's been ordering a bunch of homeless encampment suites across the city. And he's also enlisting more cops to kick out homeless people off the subways. And he is using this crisis of anti-Asian violence to like pump more money and legitimacy into the NYPD and into building more jails. But, you know, as we've all said, imperialism is it's the root cause of this problem. It's imperialism and resource extraction, right? It was Western plunder of China which impelled migration of Chinese workers to the US in the first place. And you know, we've been talking about you know, the history of anti-Chinese sentiment in the US. Well, anti-Chinese racism is as old as Chinese migration to the US itself. You know, after the immigration wave, white labor saw Chinese people as competitions for jobs, and the Chinese were subject to racism and lynchings. And they formed their own settlements, and those settlements became Chinatowns across the country. And so there were a lot of racist laws directed at Asian people, including like the Page Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act. And actually, like May 6th today, that is the anniversary of the signing of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. So, you know, you had this happening, and then meanwhile, imperialism is continuing in other Asian countries and around the Pacific. Like the Pacific is the most militarized region on Earth. It has like over 600,000 soldiers stationed. And it's like US militarism that occupies and extracts cheap labor and resources from Asian countries. And like US militarism is the greatest purveyor of anti-Asian violence, like full stop. Like, what is the greatest purveyor of anti-Asian violence than the US military, right? You have, you know, we can talk about like wars in places like Korea and Laos and Cambodia, and, you know, the US dropping bombs on all those countries, which, you know, killed family members and destroyed entire villages and forced women in those countries into a sex trade industry serving American soldiers. And so this is like another root of anti-Asian racism, right? This is sort of where this image of the fetishized, submissive, sexualized Asian woman comes from. It stems from this sex trade industry, this prostitution industry, serving US soldiers that emerged after the US bombed and destroyed those countries. And so, you know, I was talking about earlier in this show about the devaluation of human lives, of Asian lives and Asian labor. And so entire industries are built on this tacit assumption of like Asian disposability and devaluation, especially of Asian women. The military sex trade industry, like I was saying before, sweatshop garment industry, you know, obviously rife with exploitation and abuse of, a largely Asian immigrant workforce. The domestic hair industry. In New York City, there's a labor struggle going on in Chinatown where this nonprofit is forcing their largely Asian immigrant workforce to work 24-hour workdays. And so, this is like the history of anti-Asian racism that this anti-China propaganda right now like fits into, which is it's a part of. And so I think, we can't really address anti-Asian racism until we identify the root cause of it and, pull it out by its root. And we can't really do that if we are focused, solely on, placing blame on individuals.
Yeah, no, those are all really good points. To me, it's peak racism. I mean, this is the most dangerous form of racism when Americans, quote unquote, or just people in the United States, because of this propaganda, because of what they think they know about the region, they can so easily point to China and be like, China is this, China's doing that, China's imperialist, China's bad, China's killing our jobs, all of these things. When the United States has this extensive history that continues on into this day of terrorizing this region, right? You were talking about, Amanda, the mid 19th century period, the migrations. Like, what was causing the migration? Well, China was thrust into what they still call the century of humiliation, and all of that was facilitated by Western powers, various Western powers seeking to carve up China, use opium as a huge weapon in that. And the U.S. likes to say, well, we weren't that involved. We were just kind of there, but the United States was actually involved. It just wasn't the power that it ended up being maybe a century later. But nonetheless, this idea that the United States, with all this blood on its hands, literally you had during the Korean War, you had Douglas MacArthur himself having to appeal to Eisenhower, I believe, or was it Truman? Truman at the time, saying, there's too much racism in the military right now. These soldiers are using the word gook and they're just slaughtering people. Like, that's how bad it was. That's how much racism is such a weapon for war. And it's continuing on now with how the United States is approaching China. All of these anti-communist tropes, this quote unquote totalitarianism, Chinese people are brainwashed. All of this just serves an imperialist agenda. It serves what Carl was saying, right? Fueling the military industrial complex, trillions of dollars worth, the vast majority of which are going right and directed to this region of the world, directed at China. But it doesn't really receive any attention. And so, I don't know if Xiangyu, you want to jump in, or Carl, but I think that, to me, it sickens me, because it's this element, I feel, that is really fueling the racism that we see, but not many people want to touch it.
By the way, today in United States, where you guys are, is May 6th. It's the 140th anniversary of the signing of the Chinese Exclusion Act. So the Chinese Exclusion Act was signed on May 6, 1882. It's the only law in U.S. That targets specifically a nationality. Is to exclude Chinese from U.S. And as you mentioned, as you mentioned earlier, that it's at the worst of violence that the West has done to China. Right around 1900. Boxer Rebellion, when the Eight Nation Alliance, basically it's a group of Western countries plus Japan, invaded China, seized Beijing, and that's the time when the Yellow Peril propaganda reached a peak. It's kind of the I like to say it's kind of the reflection, maybe like a very perverse reflection of a guilty conscience. Right when the Western troops are actually brutalizing Chinese people in China, they concocted this Yellow Peril threat to the white European civilization, right? And how China is a yellow horde is gonna take over, and that was, of course, used to justify the Western imperialism in China itself. And also, I like to point out the worst mass lynching on U.S. soil was the 1871 Los Angeles massacre, where 19 Chinese people were murdered. So there's a long history of the anti Chinese racism in United States, and now that's just getting taken to now it's not just affecting just Chinese people. Now anybody who look remotely East Asian is getting targeted, right? We have Filipinos, we have Burmese, we have even a Sri Lankan, and then the Hispanic lady who got mistaken for Chinese was being attacked. So this is a reality of the United States. Never really changed. Never really changed that much since 1871.
Yeah. Xiangyu, you want to jump in?
I think most of what needed to be said was said, and I just wanted to add on to what Carl said. Yeah, things haven't really changed. It's just the ruling class is better at doing its PR right now. And what we're seeing is you look at corporate American culture. You look at like what is essentially what's their diversity training. Are they really trying to promote this sort of national harmony with the different peoples in America, or are they really just trying to give capitalism and by extension imperialism a woke makeover? See, that's the biggest crime of Trump in the eyes of these neoliberals is he was kind of undoing their woke makeover of imperialism. And I wanted to go back to the point that Amanda made about the way women were viewed. I think one great example is you look at the way women from the Soviet Union were portrayed, because back when it was the Soviet Union, when Western capital couldn't really penetrate the economy there, the women there were portrayed as like these like rough, like big babushka, you know. But then as soon as the Soviet Union fell, and Russia became this sort of neoliberal hellhole, what became the perception? It became like hot, young, sexy mail order brides. You know, it's not a coincidence. Like these ideas don't just fall from the sky. They're rooted in material reality. And to go back further, what Carl said about China, I think Carl and Danny were both talking about why the ramping up of hostilities with China is well, China does not threaten the average American, and this is a point that really needs to be made to average Americans of all backgrounds, because most people in this country, the vast majority, stand to benefit from mutually beneficial relations in a multipolar world. And this is a threat to the ruling class that's trying the neoliberals who are trying to like enforce liberalism on the rest of the world and this sort of cultural and political and economic hegemony. And China and also Russia, Iran, showing the world that an alternative to neoliberalism and liberalism in general is possible. And the biggest crime is that it is, one, an independent country, but two, an independent country that rejects liberalism. And this is why attitudes towards Russia changed so drastically after Vladimir Putin came to power. Because, like I said before, Russia was this neoliberal hellhole with, state assets and everything being sold for next to nothing after the fall of the Soviet Union. And although Putin is not a communist, nor is Russia a socialist country, Putin is an illiberal who reorganized the economy so that there is some semblance of independence, by the creation of reorganizing the economy, creating Gazprom, whose profits were then used to rebuild the country and bring its GDP back to the level where it was before the fall of the Soviet Union. And yeah,
I just like to interject for 1 second. Even depiction of Putin went through a drastic shift in U.S. media, because in late 1990s, I'm old, I remember that. So even in late 1990s, when Putin first came to power, U.S. tried to portray Putin as this a tough guy, but our friends, because that's when Putin went to Bill Clinton and personally asked for Russia to join NATO. right? Of course, Bill Clinton laughed in his face, but at that time, Putin's and Russia was portrayed as a friendly nation, and Putin was portrayed as this really tough bastard, but he's our friend. You know, this is what we need in Russia. But that perception then start to change when the relentless lateral expansion toward Russian border actually forced Putin to take a more assertive role. And that's when now that the narrative suddenly shifted from Putin, the tough but good guy, to this evil authoritarian dictator. So
Asiatic too.
yeah, it just shows you how U.S. propaganda machine can flip on a dime, right? And this is like you can, if you live long enough like I have, you can see it all in action.
I think
Yeah.
public opinion is very malleable, and I remember in late '90s. I still kind of remember. Okay, I was in 1999 to 2000. I was in first grade. I remember we were learning about the continents. Like you have Europe and you have Asia, and then Russia is like the country that's in both continents. And we were also learning about the American Revolution and like how we're a free country, and this was tied together. Our teacher, Mrs. Gregory. I wonder if she's still alive, but she was like, Russia used to be a dictatorship, and a dictatorship is when you have a dictator who says on Monday you have to wear yellow, and on Tuesday you have to wear black, and on Wednesday you have to wear green. But now they're becoming a free country, and it's like, well, 1990s Russia it sucked.
I wish I had that guidance, honestly. Like, tell me what to wear, please, because I don't want that pressure on me anymore. But I mean, I think these are all really good points. Like, I mean, we're talking, especially what you were talking about, Xiangyu, about this connection between the rise of China, the character, the social and economic character of China, and now we see Russia, right? Because China and Russia have this major alliance now, and it is moving the world in a different direction. It is moving the world in a multipolar, some people are calling pluripolar direction. This alliance is providing the economic and the political capital necessary to actually have what was the dream of the anti-colonial movement around the world, which was sovereignty, which was independence, which was not being controlled and dictated over by colonialism and imperialism. And that is now coming into fruition in this modern era, where I think a lot of this pearl clutching around technology, right? Oh, what are the China stealing all the patents, right? That's Pompeo and those folks like to say. Even, you have these Matt Stoller types saying, oh, the China, because there's U.S. investment in China, that it's controlling corporations here and then dictating U.S. politics. I think a lot of that is this inherent fear of a country like China, which has certain indicators and markers and goals and has a system that is fundamentally different from the US system, is looking to alleviate poverty, is looking to fight climate change, is looking to have a more peaceful world, have a world that's characterized by peace. That's a pretty big threat to a US way of life, this imperialist way of life that needs kind of the opposite of all of those things for people like Jeff Bezos and these types, for them to continue to get rich, from the military contractors to continue to get rich, for the ruling class to continue to get rich. But yeah, anyone want to jump in?
A lot of the blame China rhetoric is a deflection from criticism of of the capitalist system itself, right? I mean, the U.S. working class did suffer when the U.S. Multinationals decided to offsource the manufacturing jobs outside the United States. First, it was to the U.S. Asian client states, in like the first Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore. And when China opened up its economy in the 80s and mostly in the 90s, and all these multinationals and rushed to move their manufacturing plants to China because China was even cheaper. The labor, the land was even cheaper than what they had access to before. Again, this is a nature of capitalism. The capitalists will always chase the highest margin, lowest cost, right? And from Chinese point of view, their point of view is if you build it, they will come. They know if they build up their infrastructure, these companies will come in and build their factories there. But here we are. Oftentimes we just it just got simplified into China is stealing our jobs, right? And that's kind of the Trump crowd is banking on to just make it very simple. China is now that same rhetoric is being adopted by the Democrats as well in the United States, by the way, and it became China stealing our jobs rather than this is what capitalism does. This is the capitalist will always chase the highest margin, lowest cost. This is when when the first globalization happened, it happened under a U.S. led world order, and all these U.S. multinationals willingly chose to move their the manufacturing base out offshore, and they moved to China because China at that time provided a large labor pool, or a highly educated labor force that's working for cheap. I'm talking about back in 1990s, and then U.S. started to offsource call centers and the programming coding to India, right? This is what capitalists do, and of course because government like China, they perfectly understand that dynamic. They know if you've the capitalists, they will sell you a robe to hang themselves. So they use that to their advantage to develop the Chinese domestic economy, right? That's something that our U.S. elite is not doing. We are pouring massive resources. U.S. is today still a very rich country, still one of the richest country in the world. But instead of developing our own infrastructure, providing universal health care, we devote insanely amount of money towards the military industrial complex, because these are the people who have voices in Washington. It's Lockheed Martin, it's Boeing, it's Raytheon, and all their founded think tanks that dominated our our media landscape, right? And then they quote some pseudo leftists like Promise Lee, right, to support their arguments, and to put an Asian face on it. So this is what's happening today.
Yeah, I mean, I want to get you in here, but I just want to say that I think you're exactly right, Carl. This is an incredible projection. It's deflection for the weaknesses of U.S. capitalism. But I mean, I want to get you in here, and I'd like to go for another like 20 or so minutes. So please do, all of you, get in anything that has not been said yet, that you would like to, or just to add on to what has been. But yeah, Amanda, go right ahead.
Yeah, just to jump in on Carl's point about the military industrial complex and returning to Russia, Ukraine, with the case of Russia and Ukraine, those links of government to the military industrial complex are right there in front of our faces, right? Representatives of Lockheed Martin and Raytheon have said publicly that this war in Ukraine has been a boon for business. And they will often have representatives from Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or another like defense contractor go on cable news television, and they will act as a political pundit, commenting on the war in Ukraine, but it will never be revealed that they're actually a representative of these defense contractors. But it's obviously like it's it's very dishonest, because they want to sell weapons. So this war in Ukraine is great for business for them. And just the other day there was a video going around on Twitter of Joe Biden speaking at a Lockheed Martin factory. just before he announced he was authorizing another, however, hundreds of millions of dollars going to military aid to Ukraine. And literally every week, the US government authorizes another hundreds of millions of dollars of military aid to Ukraine. So, first of all, like the idea that this common talking point among, the Western left that we should send weapons and money to Ukraine doesn't really make much sense to me because we're already doing it. We are already sending like hundreds of millions of dollars in aid every week. Another thing these are the same people, these are the same companies that are behind a lot of this like anti-China propaganda, right? Other people have made the point that the New York Times, and usually like every anti-China article or op-ed, they interview a person from the Atlantic Council or the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Or there's like an op-ed in the New York Times written by one of these think tank representatives, but they never mention that, these think tanks are funded by these like military contractors, and they have they have a business interest in selling weapons, in escalating this anti-China rhetoric, in escalating this war rhetoric, because it is really, really good for business.
Yeah, and I was trying to pull up actually while you were talking, Foreign Policy Magazine. Matthew Kronig, he's the deputy director of Atlantic Council in February 2022, and I'll pull it up after I speak here for a second. But he wrote an op-ed about why Washington must wage war on Russia and China simultaneously, and he's the deputy director of NATO's Atlantic Council, and this is how these forces think. And you're exactly right, Amanda, to point out about how influential they are in shaping ideology and in shaping policy. I mean, they are kind of the de facto lobbies of the military-industrial complex. There's this information arm of this lobby which helps manufacture all of the consent, to use the old Chomskyan term. But I think that one thing that I wanted to just mention here is that this threat of war with China, I think, is so underestimated, right? Because now we're in the heat of this Russia-Ukraine situation, where Russia felt compelled to invade Ukraine. Based upon this large context, I don't see China making any kind of move in that situation, because I don't think China is really in a position geopolitically where it really has to do that. People are saying Taiwan is a situation. I know, Carl, you probably have a lot to say about that, and so do you, Xiangyu. But Taiwan is not an independent country. Taiwan is a part of China. It's a completely different situation. It's almost, like, to me, even more baffling given how much these old weapons are just like sent to Taiwan. And
right now,
right?
the country that's most gung ho for a cross Taiwan Strait war right now is United States. I mean,
Yeah.
if you look at the news, U.S. news, they talk about a possible Taiwan invasion like all the time, like every 2 days you get an article. But you don't see that the same in the Chinese media. Nobody in China is talking about sending the PLA into Taiwan, on like the Chinese official media channels. So it's U.S. right now. It's almost like the U.S. military industrial complex is begging, like, please, Beijing, please send PLA to Taiwan so we can, have another war-making profit opportunity. I mean, like, to go back to what Amanda said earlier about sending weapons to Ukraine, that's not even helping Ukrainian people. That's just to get more
No.
Ukrainian people killed. This is a proxy war U.S. is waged to kill Russians to fight Russians to the last Ukrainians, right? And that's the same strategy they want to do in Taiwan. It's like U.S. doesn't care if Taiwan get devastated in a war versus mainland China. And there was actually one of the, I forgot which foreign policy magazine article now, but they actually openly talk about, in case of a war breakout, the first thing they should do is to destroy the Taiwan semiconductors facility on Taiwan, so China does not get control of the chip making capabilities. So this is how people think about it. They don't think about how Taiwan will utterly be devastated. Actually, in a war scenario. This is why there's actually not to people. I don't know. Maybe Xiangyu can speak to that. I mean, the sense I get is like people in Taiwan right now is really not that concerned about an imminent war breakout, and all the freak out is you see happening is in Washington Post, in New York Times, and a lot of these articles ties back to all these various think tank authors. And as something you guys, both Amanda and Danny, mentioned about Atlantic Council dominating our mainstream media channels. Now their narrative has been challenged by alternative media like YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, etc. Now they're trying to control social media. Atlantic Council is partnering up with Facebook and Twitter to censor quote unquote disinformation, right? I mean,
and ASPI, the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, which we've all talked about on separate occasions, I know.
Nathan.
Right, Nathan, our boy Nathan Rooster. He, that think tank also has a partnership with Twitter to also, take down and target so-called Chinese disinformation operations or whatever things that you are called, Carl. But the ASPI is funded by the Australian Department of Defense, the U.S. Department of State, and all of the military contractors that you could think of. And, Carl, you were making a very good point about Ukraine, about how much the U.S. fueling and pumping weapons and aid, so-called aid, quote unquote, into Ukraine. It's not free. All of it's like, it reminds me of this is a more neo-colonial situation, I think, than during like the Second World War. But the U.S. did this during the Second World War, though, with the Lend-Lease program. They provided weapons. They provided a lot of military assistance to the so-called allies. And when it was all said and done, when Europe was destroyed and the U.S. created this Bretton Woods system, they told the European former colonial powers to pay up. And that's what's been happening ever since. I mean, and that's part of this dollar imperialism. In Ukraine was already in this dire straits economically through the IMF and the way that the U.S. since 2014, the coup, has been manipulating and really putting Ukraine under its economic thumb. But it's only going to get worse, right? Because this isn't free. These aren't free weapons, and this isn't free quote unquote aid. It's all going to be expected to pay back, and it's going to be shock therapy for Ukraine. And for the U.S., they hope to be able to do that, and they are doing that across the NATO region, especially with the Eastern European and regional statelets that are in NATO. But Xiangyu, you want to jump in about Carl when he was talking about Taiwan question?
I forgot exactly what I wanted to say, but I want people to think about this fact is that according to top brass in the U.S. military and reports by the RAND Corporation, which I mean obviously isn't trying to pump up China or anything like that. In the case of a war breaking out between the two sides of the strait, Taiwan would probably last less than a week. So, I mean, the U.S. knows this, so why is it still pumping weapons into Taiwan and promoting escalations? Because here's the thing. Beijing is not interested in immediate reunification. It wants to create a situation where the people in Taiwan will want reunification, and it wants a stable reunified China. It knows if it wanted to reunify China by force, it could do so at any time, no problem. But the problem is, by doing that, you're going to create a Taiwan that's even more capable of destabilizing the rest of China than currently, So that is why it is my belief that the U.S. doesn't care about whether or not Taiwan's falls, as the way they would say, falls under the rule of Beijing. In fact, it kind of welcomes it, because then you look at Hong Kong. I mean, Hong Kong wasn't returned to China by force, but it was done so in a time where the contradictions of capitalism really revealed themselves after the return. So then people will think back to, the times before Chinese leadership, when it was still a British colony, and then they'll look at now, and then they'll look at the decay of capitalism, and then the CPC becomes an easy scapegoat. And a lot of the problems in Hong Kong, honestly, stem from the fact that too much of the old system has been kept intact. And I mean, Beijing is smart enough to want to prevent that with Taiwan. So the last thing it wants is reunification by force, but rather it wants to continue strengthening economic ties across the strait, which is happening, which is also why liberals in Taiwan are kind of more vocal about things, because they do feel threatened that things are going to change, because the world as they know it, they do feel a shift in the power dynamic. It's quite reasonable. So I'm not too concerned about this. And Taiwan is not Ukraine, like you mentioned, and the leadership of China is not the same as the leadership of Russia. It's unless things that are just completely unpredicted happen, we're not going to see the same situation going on there. That's my belief. But I also
Yeah.
believe that Russia wasn't going to enter Ukraine, so who knows?
Well, Carl's going to rejoin in a second, but I think those are all really good points about the Taiwan situation. And I think we're running into the closing. Let's say closing statement period. So each of you have a few minutes or so to just anything that has not been said. For those of you who are still watching, make sure that you're liking the video, of course, subscribing to the channel, and please do support this work at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. But I'll kick it over to Amanda. A few minutes. Anything that you would like to get in here that hasn't gone in here yet, and then we can move on to Xiangyu, and then when Carl's back, get to him, and then I can close things up.
Yeah. I guess I want to end with like maybe a call to action. Or, I don't want to end it on a very pessimistic note. I guess like one thing I want to say is that, we were talking about East Asian privilege earlier in the show. One thing that I do want to mention is that like another thing East Asian privilege does is that it kind of ignores the links that revolutionary Chinese people made with like other communities like at that time, ignores revolutionary groups like Yiwu Quan, I think they're called. They're like a revolutionary group in Chinatown in San Francisco who did a lot of mutual aid programs and like breakfast programs. They were like very inspired by the Black Panthers. So, like the model minority myth and East Asian privilege kind of ignore those like groups doing like revolutionary work at that time. So what I would like people who like talk about East Asian privilege do is sort of get involved in work that's already happening in Chinatown right now. There are a lot of, what I think we should do is think about things that unite us across communities. Like, Asian people are also subject to police brutality. Like Asian sex workers are subject to like surveillance and police brutality. There are a lot of different labor struggles going on in like New York City, Chinatown right now. I mentioned the labor struggle earlier of like the Asian immigrant workers fighting against the 24-hour workday that this nonprofit called the Chinese American Planning Council that are forcing them to work these 24-hour workdays. So that there's that going on. There is the Jingfong labor struggle. Jingfong is the largest dim sum restaurant in Chinatown, and it was like one of the few restaurants in New York City that had like a unionized staff. But Jonathan Chu, the landlord, during the pandemic, he decided to close down that restaurant, putting everyone out of their jobs. So there's a picket in front of the Museum of Chinese in America like every Sunday, and I think like a few other days during the week. And they picket in front of that museum because Jonathan Chu he sits on the board of the Museum of Chinese in America. And so, you can go there and you can show support for like Chinese working class people. And you can like link up with people there. And, I just don't think I really want people to, be spurred into action and actually do something to try and address like this crisis of like anti-Asian racism. I don't want to be pessimistic and say that, this is something that like can't be tackled.
Yeah, yeah, and Carl, you're back, but I think we'll go to Xiangyu next. But no, those are. I mean, I think that's really important, and at the end, I want all of you to plug your stuff as well. What people should, where people should find you guys. But Xiangyu, any closing remarks, and then Carl.
Yes, I have a few closing remarks and are really brief. But before I start them, one of my friends, Carl, all four screens, I want to see Carl's reaction. My Korean friends asked, "What is up with Carl's background and the quality of his video? We're talking about stereotypes. He's gonna make the world think Chinese people are all on 56K."
My wife actually made this wonderful background for me, including the plaque for my podcast. So thanks to my beautiful wife.
Exactly. That's what I told him. But yeah, I wanted to see your reaction. And closing remarks, I just wanted to say, the same people who lied to you about, who are lying to you about NATO and Russia right now, while gas prices are rising and there's an imminent food shortage that's going to come, in part because of sanctions on Russia and the lack of availability of fertilizer as a result, and a lot of things. They lied about the war in Iraq, lied about Syria and Assad, and lied about Gaddafi. They're also the same people who are lying to you about East Asian privilege, this, that, and the other. Because here's the thing, the vast majority of working class Asian immigrants don't speak English, so you're not going to be hearing a lot of you're not going to hear a lot of their voices in the media. So I want people to just really, the same way you challenge your belief about everything else I mentioned, just please question what you're hearing about, these issues that we spoke about today. Yeah.
Yeah, you are more qualified to speak about working class Asian American, Xiangyu. You actually work in the Chinese restaurant, right? I mean, you interface with working class Chinese people in America every day. And so what I want, my concluding remark, I just want to say, like, for the people who live in the imperial core, right? What we can be more effective is to demand to hold our own governments to accountable, to demand our own government to be more responsible for happenings inside United States. We should not be worried about what's happening abroad. When is the last time U.S. interventionism has done anything good, right? So instead of answering the call, so we got to do something about this, we got to do something about Syria, we got to do something about Ukraine. No, this is, why do we have to do anything? We have all the problems that you guys are intimately much more familiar with the actual problems inside United States than problem in faraway lands like Syria, Ukraine, or Solomon Islands, which most of the information, frankly, came from all these mainstream propaganda channels. So let's focus on improve U.S., make it a better place, and this is where you can actually exercise your democratic rights, to demand your government to be more accountable, to invest more in the communities rather than weapons, sending weapons abroad. That's just my pitch.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate that. I think, the overarching message for me is that this can be framed, as you said, Amanda, as a very pessimistic issue, right? Because all you hear about in the media, because that's what will get the clicks and the hits, are, well, this, and it should be talked about, right? This person was assaulted, this person was murdered, uh, and then of course the media headlines about how China is so bad. China is coming for your lunch, right? That China is this huge quote unquote threat. It does bring this very cloudy atmosphere. But for me, I feel like this period is a very hopeful one, in the sense that, for one, all of the efforts that you were talking about, Amanda, and also that framework that you gave, Carl, I mean, it really is becoming, I think, more and more simple and basic to understand, right? That there is a struggle going on, that there is a possibility to fight back against this and all of its connections, and that there is I think, a very easy line to take, that I think, Carl, that you articulated so well, is that we can demand that our government and that our and confront our system in the crimes against humanity that it commits at home and abroad, and link those two together so that it has some relevance to people's day-to-day lives. And we have a situation, I think, around the world where, whenever you have the United States so infuriated at another country like China, usually it means it's doing something right. And that is happening right now at a scale that I don't think most people in the United States and in the Western world have any understanding about, because most people were so propagandized during the latter half of the Cold War. They didn't understand the role of the Soviet Union. And now you have a situation where most people don't understand what the role of China is, right? How China is sort of doing its thing, how it's organizing itself, how it's successfully containing the pandemic, how it is economically growing at a pace and addressing an unprecedented pace, and then addressing things like common prosperity and poverty alleviation, and doing its part as a major political and economic power in the world to fight climate change. I mean, none of these things are talked about. And then also leading the charge toward a world that actually places peace as a priority. And this even goes, I was listening to you earlier today, Carl, on Rob Rousseau's show, and you were saying that, and there was a conversation about China's role as actually promoting peace and taking a real neutral position and saying, we promote the UN Charter and self-determination, and that is a very consistent policy, and that should all give us hope internationally. And then domestically, what can give us hope is, I think, everything that you said, Amanda and Carl, is that there is a possibility to fight. There are opportunities to do so. This isn't hopeless, and with struggle with oppression comes resistance. So I want to just leave the last minute for all of you to plug your stuff before we close here. So
Okay.
Amanda, how about you first? Or unless, Carl, you want to respond.
I
But
just
Amanda,
wanted to add a last thing. The U.S. imperialism and improving life standard of average American domestically, these are incompatible goals, right? I mean, there are people who are on quote unquote progressive left are saying now U.S. China competition is a good a shot in the arm to make to make America great again. But look, why do we even need U.S. China competition to motivate us to make U.S. a better place? Improving U.S. should always be the top priority, to improve the average life of the average people in United States. But people need to understand that is incompatible with the U.S. imperialism abroad, because it takes away the resources. All our resources are diverted into the military industrial complex to funnel away to not only make our bring misery to millions abroad, but also make actually have an adverse impact on the life inside United States. So my rant is over. Thank you.
Where can people follow you, Carl? Follow you, and then I'll.
I'm on Twitter. I ship post a lot, so go to, it's just my name, Carl Za. That's my Twitter handle, and I sometimes I post on Facebook as well. I have a podcast, the Silk and Steel podcast. Much of the free content you can find it online. It's on all the podcasting platform, iTunes, Spotify. But please check out my Patreon, because that's my main source of income right now, how I support my family in Bali. So go to Patreon and search Silk and Steel, or just type in Silk. My podcast should be the first link that pop up. And most of my content is on my Patreon site. So thank you.
Cool. So how about Xiangyu? You want a closing remark? Well, I mean, plug, and then I know you had a thought.
Yeah, I'll do the quick closing remark first. If none of what we said resonates with you, and you just really hate Chinese people, and I can't really change your mind on that, so you do you. But if you really hate us Chinese people and you don't want us in America, then the best way to prevent more Chinese people from entering the U.S. is to stand up against destabilization attempts against China. Because the better China's economy does, the less likely Chinese people will want to leave China. And you don't need to view things as a zero-sum game. There can be win-win cooperation between the two countries. But it doesn't just fall from the sky. It needs to be fought for. And if you like what I said, or if you want to engage in flame wars with me, though I'm trying to be better with that and not engage as much, you can follow me on Twitter at not Xiangyu. That is NOTXIANGYU. You can follow me at Instagram at Comrade Xiangyu, and my Facebook page. It's mostly in Chinese though, because it's for my audience in Taiwan. Facebook.com/Comrade Xiangyu. Weibo, same thing. Weibo.com/Comrade Xiangyu, or at Zhong Xiangyu XY. Zhong is in traditional. And then youtube.com/XYZ rap. I'm gonna be releasing new music videos soon. Should have been shot, but COVID situation caused the shoot to be postponed to next week. So I'll be back in New York, where Danny and Amanda are, pretty soon. So yeah,
and also Xiangyu has promised once he finishes the music video and finish it with his album, that he will come back to the Silk and Steel podcast to continue our Korean War series. So I'm going to hold you to your promise.
It was promised after I leave the restaurant, but one of the restaurants where I work, but it's still not being sold because the buyers are really finicky. I haven't met more finicky people in my life. But
well, it's always epic when you two get together. That's for sure. It's always epic.
So people put pressure on Xiangyu, and we I think the free episode of our Korean War series and our Taiwan series is on my YouTube channel. So I forgot to plug my YouTube channel. I do have a YouTube channel, just Carl Za, and all the good stuff is there. So
cool. All right, Amanda.
All right. I also have, you can follow me on Twitter at catcontentonly, which is what you see in my name right now. Please follow me. Also, please check out my podcast. It's called Radio Free Amanda. It's now on Spotify, but also check out the Patreon. I also encourage you to subscribe to the Patreon, because like Carl, that's my primary source of income. So would really appreciate it if you subscribed. So
yeah, definitely check out everyone's work here. I mean, this was a really great conversation. Thanks so much, of course, to the esteemed panelists, good friends of this program, friends in general. Follow all of their work. Of course, before you leave here, make sure you're liking this video and you're subscribing to the channel. If you can, give a birthday subscription to the Patreon at patreon.com/Danny Haiphong. This is a good way to kick off. I mean, if I were in Bali right now, I'd already be celebrating my birthday, but I still got one day to go. I wish I were in Bali. I wish I were anywhere but here sometimes. But you know how it is. But nonetheless, this was a great stream. Thank you all so much for coming on. And be sure everyone to subscribe, hit that notifications bell so you know when this channel is going live, and you know that YouTube is throttling the hell out of, I mean, social media. We talked a little bit about it. We're all getting throttled right now, all of us here. 1, 2, 3, 4, all 4 of us. The algorithms are not our friends because of what we talk about here. So make sure you're keeping aware, keeping a pace of what we're doing, and checking out all of our work. But thanks all so much for coming on this Friday evening out here in the U.S. Eastern Time. And I will be live again soon. But peace out, everybody.
Happy birthday, Danny.
I was hoping you'd sing it.
Oh, yeah, you forget to sing it.
Take care, everyone.